And thanks, Paul. Oh, man, thank you once again. Everyone, please. And now, I'd like to introduce our guest for the week, Dr. Susan Berry, Stereo Sue. Now, she was given that title in a New Yorker article by the famed Dr. Oliver Sacks. Her first book, Fixing My Gaze, tells the story of her experience going from 2D vision to stereo vision. Very unusual for that to occur later in life. And we're very fortunate that she has such a brilliant and she's such a brilliant and prolific writer and able to explain that process and her experiences. Her new book, Coming to Our Senses. I like to hold this stuff up. Uh, Her new book, Coming to Our Senses, details the experience of folks who gain the miracles of sight and hearing and what that tells us about these senses and the amazing adaptive nature of the human brain. I was once watching an interview that Charlie Rose was conducting with a doctor where she mentioned a conversation she was having at a party with another doctor who was saying that the brain is the most important organ in the body. And she thought about it for a minute and realized what was telling her that. She didn't have one of these, but I do. So, please welcome Dr. Susan Berry.
For my first 48 years, I was cross-eyed and stereo blind. And as you can see from these photos of me as an infant and a toddler, if I looked at you with my right eye, I turned the left one in. And if I looked at you with my left eye, I turned in the right eye. And since the two eyes were looking at different places in space, they presented a very confusing view to the brain. So in order to have a single view of the world, I would suppress input from the turned eye. And actually, the more I turned in the eye, the better I could suppress it. And of course, if you suppress input from one eye, you have no stereo vision. I had 3 surgeries as a child, but I still remained cross-eyed and stereo blind until the age of 48 when I undertook vision therapy. And the next slide just shows examples of different vision therapy procedures. But in short, what the therapy taught me, and I did this under the direction of a developmental optometrist named Teresa Ruggiero, what the vision therapy taught me was how to point my 2 eyes at the same place in space at the same time. And when I did that, I began to see in 3D. And this was totally surprising because it was thought that 3D vision had to develop in the earliest years of life or it could never develop. And it was also astonishing to me because I could now see the space between things and I could see in a way that I could not previously have imagined. One of the most beautiful sights that I could see was trees. So here's a photograph and an anaglyph made by Jerry Marks of the New York Stereoscopic Society. And when I now looked at trees, instead of seeing the canopies as flat, like in a children's drawing, I could see the leaves in layers and layers and layers of depth. It was like a 3D mosaic in 3D. And this picture, by the way, was taken at Madison Square Park. Even when the trees were empty of their leaves, as is shown in the next slide, they were still spectacular because I could see how the outer branches would enclose and capture a volume of space through which the inner branches permeated. And this picture too comes to us thanks to Gerald Marks, and it was taken at the Intrepid Museum, and you can actually see the test space shuttle, the Enterprise, in the background. Well, I wrote a letter to Oliver Sacks about my experiences gaining 3D vision. And he then wrote a story about me that appeared in the June 2006 issue of the New Yorker called Stereo Sue. And this article was illustrated with a stereo pair showing an old-time view of Fifth Avenue in New York with the Flatiron Building in the distance. And again, Jerry Marks was kind enough to make for me an anaglyph of the stereo pair, which we can now all enjoy. And then 3 years after that article came out, I published my own book, Fixing My Gaze, A Scientist's Journey into Seeing in Three Dimensions, in which I went into much more detail than Oliver Sacks was able to do in a short article, much more detail about binocular vision, stereo vision, strabismus, that's my condition, cross-eyed or wall-eyed, and vision therapy. And I don't really have time now to tell you what really I wrote about in this book, but I couldn't resist showing this anaglyph photograph, again, taken by Jerry Marks. And it shows my audience at a New York Live Arts talk in 2014. And I was having them all practice with the Brock string, which was one of my favorite vision therapy tools to teach me how to point the two eyes at the same place in space at the same time. And if you look carefully on the right side, you might see somebody familiar.
Hey, I'm out of uniform and I still have that shirt. And as soon as this meeting's over, I'm getting rid of it. But
Anyway, I had such joy, like a childlike glee from seeing the world in 3D, from seeing snowfalls in 3D, from even seeing a sink faucet jutting out at me in 3D, that I wondered if I got such joy from going from stereo blind to stereo vision, what would it be like to go from being blind to having vision? And the answer is quite the opposite. And here I'm just illustrating 3 studies, one done by Gregory and Wallace, recovery from early blindness, about a man named SB, who at 52 was given sight. He was initially very excited about it, but the vision very frustrated him. After a few years, he still couldn't read and drive with his eyes. And as a result, his health started to erode. And within 2 years of the operation, he actually died. To See and Not See is an article written by Oliver Sacks about a man named Virgil, who also gained sight late in life from a cataract operation, but ultimately rejected his vision. And the book, Space and Sight by von Senden, is a discussion of 66 cases of adults who gained sight. And at the time was very comprehensive because gaining sight in adulthood is very rare. Von Senden concluded that the initial excitement over first seeing is usually followed by a psychological crisis. It's not always the case, but it often is. And so I was very excited in 2010 to meet a young man named Liam McCoy, who's shown here, because he was born practically blind. And then at the age of 15, thanks to operations which gave him intraocular lenses, powerful intraocular lenses, he began to see. And think about the eye chart. Liam's vision before his operations was 22,000. He could not see that E on the top of the Snellen eye chart that's shown here. After his operations, his acuity was at 20/40, which is a near normal acuity. So what could he see? And his story, along with others, is described in my new book, Coming to Our Senses, which was just published in June. It's available on Amazon. It's available in bookstores. So when we look out on the world, what we see instantly is a landscape with objects in it, and those objects arranged in a 3-dimensional way. What Liam saw was not objects, but lines and patches of colors all on one flat plane. And this is what he wrote. I think of a line as a difference between 2 colors, the point where 2 colors meet. These lines make up everything I see. A surface is pretty much consistent until you come across a line. If there's a line on a surface, it could mean a change in horizontal to vertical, like the corner of a room, or a change in depth, like the drop-off of a stair or curb, or it could also mean nothing important pertaining to the physical structure, like a crack between floor tiles or sidewalk squares. It's almost impossible for us to grasp what that would be like to see, because the lines and the colors that we see automatically assemble themselves into meaningful objects. But I tried here with a photograph to get an idea of this. So in this photograph, you can see lines around bricks, lines around stones, but it might take you a minute to figure out exactly what you are looking at. I took this photograph by standing on the top of a stair landing, and the top of the stair landing is in the bottom of the photograph, and looking down then 1, 2, 3 steps to a flagstone path beyond. But you see, the photograph flattened the whole image. And also I cropped the photograph so there's not much context to it. And without context, the sort of the big picture view, and without any sense of depth, whether from one eye or from two, it can be, and then plus just newly having sight and so not recognizing a lot of things because you've never seen them before, it can be an exhausting process to try to understand what you're seeing. So in the next slide, we see a cup, a spoon, and a bowl. Easy peasy, right? Well, if you were newly sighted, you might see the two parts of the spoon, the two visible parts of the spoon, the scooper part and the handle, as two separate objects. The world to you would seem much more fragmented. And think about it, we live in a cluttered world. We hardly ever see the full view of an object. Often one object it's partially blocked. Our view of it is partially blocked by other things that are in front of it. But now think about this. Take a hold of the spoon by the handle and move it back and forth. As you do that, the whole spoon moves of a piece. And now you can see that the scooper part of the spoon and the handle are all part of one object. So it shouldn't surprise you that people who gain sight as adults, often the first thing they can recognize are things that move, like cars and animals, or things that we are often moving about, like a bottle. And this also can explain why for Liam, one of the first things that he could do with his new sight was play catch. So he could see the ball, it moved of a piece, and when the ball moved against a static background, it was easy to see that the ball was its own unique object because it stood out from the static background. And while the first time Liam was playing catch, he also made an observation, he made a discovery. He was watching this circular thing come toward him. And this circular thing was getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it hit him in the head. And then he realized that it was the ball. And what he was seeing was that objects loom larger as they approach. This is something we just simply take for granted, but it was something that Liam had to learn. So Liam, before he gained his new sight, he could only see things clearly that were like an inch or two from his face, and he couldn't see anything more than a few feet away. So he never developed a sense of depth that we develop both through one eye and through two. So take, for example, this picture of a hallway. We know that the sides of the hall are parallel, but because of perspective, they appear to converge as you look into the distance. Liam did not initially have that knowledge. Shortly after his operations, he looked down a hall and he saw a girl waving at him. And he saw the lines, the sides of the hall converging, but instead of thinking of that as the hall extending out in space, he saw it as the hall going upward. And so to him, it looked like the girl was standing on the top of a trapezoid. When we look at the Ponzo illusion, this is a very famous illusion. You see railroad tracks. And you see them as going into the distance, both because of linear perspective, the converging lines, and also because of texture gradients. The tracks seem to get closer and closer and closer together the further away you look. Now, the two white bars that you see on top of those railroad tracks, they are actually the same width. And I know this is something that Johnny Laser was talking about. It's impossible to see them as the same width, even though they actually are. So when the images of those two bars are covering the same amount of space on your retina, yet because we interpret the one of the bars, bar higher up on the page here, on the slide here, as being further away, we see it as bigger. When I showed this illusion to Liam, he did not see the two bars as being different in size. Both of the bars were, to him, the same width, because he saw this as a design going upward onto the top of the page, as opposed to as railroad tracks going into the distance. However, we have the corridor illusion. And here too, the pole on the left and the pole on the right are the same height. But we see the pole on the right as further away, and we interpret it then as being taller. And interestingly, when I showed this corridor illusion to Liam, he saw the two poles as being both the same size and being different sizes, both at the same time. His interpretation, his view of it was unstable. And then he said to me that the pole that intersects more wall lines, that is the pole more to the right in the slide, the pole that intersects more wall lines looks like it's a little bit taller. And I thought this was really interesting because that meant Liam wasn't just concentrating on looking at the poles, but he was seeing the poles within the context, within their background. And the more he can see things within a context, the more automatic, the more global, the better his vision is going to be.
So really, you're counting on experience. The brain is counting on experience to give you that image. It's literally what's landing on the retina is heading into the processing, and the processing is forcing you into that experience of thinking that's bigger. There's like,
And that experience we mostly get within the first couple years of life, which is why we don't remember learning to see, because we don't really remember what happened in those first years of life. But if you observe an infant, you'll see that they're like in a constant exploratory state. They are constantly moving around. They're constantly looking. They're constantly moving their heads. And they are putting all this together in those first few years. And they're doing it on their own. We're not actually teaching them. No one said to you at some point in your life, well, unless you went to art school, you know, lines
mhm.
converge, parallel lines converge as you look in the distance. That's not how you figured that out. You figured it out through experience. Speaking of experience, when we look at this particular slide, what you see are bumps on the left and pits on the right. And why do we see it that way? Why do we see something convex on the left and concave on the right? Well, if you take a close look, you'll notice that for the bumps, they are lighter on the top and darker on the bottom. And for the pits, the opposite. They're darker on the upper part of the, on the top and lighter on the bottom. And this is because we see light as coming from above. That's our experience. The sun is above us. Room lights are usually above us. And so if you do indeed have a surface that's convex, that's a bump, then the light is going to be bright on the top of that bump, and then the bottom of that bump is going to be in shadow. And the reverse is true for a pit. If you took the slide and turned it over, what had been the pits would become the bumps, and vice versa. When I talked about this slide with Liam, he said that when he first began to see in 3D, he did not see bumps and pits. What he saw were just circles, flat circles, and with different gradations of grays along them, but they were flat. But now, more and more, he is seeing them as bumps and pits, like the rest of us do. However, Liam has a hard time with shadows. Take a look at this this picture. So on the upper part of the picture, you see 3 balls, and they are sitting on a surface, and their shadows are attached to the balls, and they look like they're sitting on the surface. Now take a look at the bottom picture, and you see 3 balls. They're actually in exactly the same place as in the upper picture, but the shadows are not. The shadows for 2 of those balls are detached. They appear below the balls, and the balls appear to be floating. When I showed this picture to Liam, he did not see the balls at the bottom half of the picture as floating. He saw the balls in the same place for the upper and lower parts of the picture. And he saw the bottom picture as a design with the 3 balls and the shadows of those balls making a V. So he was not using shadows in the same way we do to interpret depth. But I don't want to leave you with the idea that Liam is completely disabled by his vision. he is able to get around using his vision in combination with his white cane. He learned how to use a cane when he was very young, and what he has found is he can use the cane to confirm what his vision tells him. So if his vision says, hey, there's a stair coming up, he can use his cane to confirm that. He can use his cane to explore what's right around him, and then use his vision to try to get a picture of the bigger context. So he very much likes going to new places and exploring them, and he finds the combination of the cane and the vision to be great. And also, Liam's work is highly visual. It's the kind of work he never could have done without the operations that he had. And that's because he studies the retina, and he studies how the retina is put together. So in this picture here, in this slide, on the left, you see an eye, and you see the retina in the back of the eyeball. And then the schematic on the right shows the various cellular layers in the retina. Further back in the retina, almost to the very back of the retina, are the rods and cone cells, which absorb the light. And then they communicate with bipolar cells, which communicate with retinal ganglion cells. And it's the retinal ganglion cells that send their axons down the optic nerve to the rest of the brain. There are also other cells in the retina, the horizontal cells, amacrine cells, and so on. And the whole retina is a beautifully layered, organized structure. Well, what Liam does is he looks at EM, electron micrograph serial sections of the retina. So here is a very thin section, cross section of the retina, as if you were looking down on it. And what you see is, well, you see a lot of lines and squiggles and shapes, right? What Liam sees actually are different types of cells. He has learned what all of these squiggles and lines represent. Liam labeled for me what some of these cells are. The AMC stands for amacrine cell, BPC for bipolar cell, RGC for retinal ganglion cell. And what he does then is he highlights a given cell, goes to the next section, a little bit deeper in the retina, highlights the same cell again, does it for the next section and the next section, and so on and so on and so on. And then with the use of the computer, he can make a 3D reconstruction of that cell. So here's a given bipolar cell. The long orange part hanging down is the axon. And as you go from one cell to the next, you can start reconstructing the whole retina. And so in the next slide, what you see are many bipolar cells that have been reconstructed in this way. Each color is a different bipolar cell. And you can also see one retinal ganglion cell, that's the white one, that's sort of horizontal, that is sort of meandering through. And so in this way, you can start to reconstruct the entire retina. And if you think about it, Liam's particular way of seeing may predispose him for this kind of work. Because unlike the rest of us, when he looks out on the world, he doesn't see a whole. He doesn't all of a sudden see a landscape with a house over here and a car over there. He has to kind of put everything together piece by piece. And that's exactly what he is doing when he's at work. He's putting the retina together, one part of the cell after another, just like the way he has to put together the real world.
So the retinal, the ganglion cells and the bipolar cells are it's kind of backwards, right? Because the light's coming in, so they have to pass through that to get to the cones, right?
Mm-hmm. And so many of the layers are transparent, but when you talk about the fovea, the high acuity central region of our retina, the part that sees the sharpest, all of these other cells in the more superficial layers are moved aside so that the cone cells, and there are only cone cells in the fovea, there are no rod cells, so that the cone cells are not, the light coming in is in no way impeded by any other cells in front of them. And so the fovea, our fovea is also invaginated in, and so it looks like a pit. And the word fovea in Latin means pit.
Oh, that's fascinating. When does this occur? At what age does this actually process occur?
It happens after birth. So the fovea is not completely developed at birth, and infants do not have adult level acuity. Their acuity is much poorer than an adult. And but then over the next few months, the fovea invaginates, more cone cells move into it, and the retina starts to, you know, to mature. Curiously, with Liam, because he has albinism, which is one of the things that compromised his vision. Not the only thing, but one of the things that compromised his vision. When a person has albinism, because of the lack of melanin, the pigment, which is present not only in the skin but in the eyes, the eye does not develop normally, and the foveal pit does not develop normally as it should. So it's one of the reasons Liam will never have 20/20 acuity, supposedly perfect acuity, because his fovea, due to the albinism, did not develop normally.
Where does that pigment end up in the eye?
Well, part of it ends up in your iris, and anyone with green eyes or brown eyes has melanin in their iris. And it's also important in the very back of the retina to pick up sort of stray light rays. And that's why people with albinism who lack that melanin in the back of the retina, what's called the retinal pigmented epithelium, one of the reasons why they're so sensitive to bright light, because there's nothing there to sort of absorb the scattered light. There's no melanin back there to do it, or very little.
I read recently that the that the retina uh, it has the highest metabolic process in the body. It takes a lot to run the retina.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Um,
That amazes me in and of itself. Like it runs hot.
right, it runs hot, and in fact, when you're in the dark, the neurons in the retina are still talking to each other. And so, yeah, it runs really hot. And also, my optometrist has told me that she can tell a tremendous amount about the health of a person just looking at their retina and the distribution of blood vessels in the retina, and the condition of those blood vessels. Tells her a lot about the cardiovascular state of a.
You really shed light on that subject. I really, yeah, no, I'm full of these. The grandkids are certainly going to get tired of me really quickly. But now we're going to move on to, we're going to add a few folks to the mix. Now, if you would please welcome Samuel TRESSLET IV, the co-writer and director of the newly released film LEDA. Hopefully I'm saying that right. LEDA, just in case I botch it.
You got
That's
it.
Thank you. A black and white 3D film with no dialogue but a musical score. I've seen it. It's brilliant. We attended the premiere a few weeks ago, as you recall. Actually, just posted the video to our YouTube and Roku and Amazon Fire channel. When you get a chance, take a look at our interview. Anyway, and you know what? And we'll bring in Paul too if you have a moment, because Paul Hutchins, if he's around. The Yeah, great, great. Well, the question I would have for you, um, Samuel, in making a film, you've seen the stuff that, well, you've listened to the explanation and that wonderful session that she just presented. Uh, what part of your creative process could you see reflected in those explanations? Like what? Because you came into this completely with a writer's attachment, something that you really wanted to say as a writer. Can you see some of the things that drew you in? I'll let you go because I'm answering my
Most
own question.
definitely. I mean, I can see why you pulled me into this as a filmmaker, because I think filmmaking really is an art of perception. And Stu, thanks for the presentation. I'm super excited to read your book and your earlier book about your stereo experience, because just hearing that, super exciting for me to think of like how much we really take for granted. And I still find myself on the subway looking down the line at the 3D and just like trying to remind myself like this is pretty wild that we get to see this every day, and we normally don't think about that. And in filmmaking, I think it's like that. To a casual observer, you might think you're just telling a story in pictures, and that's that. But when you really start to break it down, there's so many elements and so many of these perceptive cues that we're using specifically to tell a story, and especially telling a story like I did, without the use of dialogue. It's all a visual, a sonic, and kind of an experience you're trying to show through perception. Not only are we choosing what kind of lens to show. I mean, the camera basically is an eye, and if you're shooting in stereo like we did, we have two eyes. But you're forcing an audience to see something from like a distance that you show them. If I'm using a wide lens up close, and I have a completely different experience than a similar shot that's far away with a long lens. In 2D photography and in 3D photography, we're using depth cues through our depth of field, having stuff in the background out of focus. So with the 2D pictures, that's really what we've been taught, from the birth of cinema, is things in the background should be out of focus. Obviously, someone like Orson Welles did the opposite, trying to get everything so you could look at everything. But it gives you and the audience immediate cues to kind of know what to focus on, as well as lighting and shading and all these things. It's really interesting to hear that Liam seems to really be struggling with lighting cues, like how light's affecting objects rather than just the lines of the objects and where the light's coming from. But these are all very, very important things in telling a story, and things that you might not originally imagine are affecting us in the backs of our brains, not just in like what we're immediately seeing, but how do I relate to a character depending on what lens I'm using, what camera I'm using. And then also you have the temporal aspect. I've got how I'm pacing something and what shot I'm putting to another shot, because editing also is very different aspect of perspective. Am I coming from this wide shot and then punching into extreme close up to an eyeball or something? And what am I trying to say by that? So yeah, from my perspective in my art form, it is extremely, you're basically designing a perspective experience for someone, and what do you want them to get out of that? Kind of like a thrill ride of perspective.
Excellent. Now, Susan, the physiological, like those learned cues through life, everybody learns them at a different, well, obviously when they're young, but they experience them in different ways, and that's
Sure.
that mechanism. But yet they all grow. Like everyone can watch a movie, right, and get that experience. What do you think in the brain kind of makes that possible? Because again, it seems like all these different visual dialects are going on, yet you can sit and get the experience that Samuel mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. For example, the camera becomes your eyes, and it zooms in or it pans the scene. And how is it that you know the spectators, they're not using their eyes, they're not using their head, but how is it that can work? And I think that's part of what a good cinematographer has to do. I mean, if the information is too discontinuous, then people aren't going to be able to follow it. But it is kind of amazing how well people can follow that. And it may be an indication that we are used to constantly changing our own point of view. And you think about it as you're walking along, even walking through your house. You walk out of the bedroom, you walk down a hall, you walk into the kitchen, you're constantly seeing new points of view. You're seeing new views entirely. And so I guess in a way, you get used to that. Also, have you read the book, Samuel? Have you read the book I think it's called In the Blink of an Eye by Walter Murch?
Oh yeah, the editor, yes.
Yeah, so he's a film editor, known for editing the Godfather movies, among others. And he talked about how the editing process is all about that. It's like, here's this scene, here's that scene. How which scene should I include, and how should I edit this so that the audience not only follows the story, but you build the story from it. And he came up with some really interesting conclusions. And one was that he noticed that whenever he made a break in an edit, it was when people blinked.
Yeah.
And that when you blink, that blinking may not be the whole thing about what you blink to keep your eyes moist, that when you blink, it's like that's at a point when you have a shift in your
Sure.
thinking, or maybe
Like a
that's the
natural
point where
reset.
you're going to now look somewhere else, and since we all do that, and maybe a good editor kind of he noticed that he was often editing, he was often making a cut when a person blinked their eyes. Have you noticed that,
Well,
Samuel?
definitely. And I mean, I know that from that book specifically as well. Obviously, I feel like I think that's one technique to make it kind of feel natural and such. But
Mhm.
I can't say I dove into the timing because I'm more of from the band camp of Eisenstein, the Soviet editor, which
Mhm.
a lot of it's he does a lot of things that are like match form cuts where one object is next to another one in the image, and he did Battleship Potemkin
Sure.
and different films like that.
My grandfather
But
met the man who led the rebellion on the battleship Potemkin.
oh wow,
He
but I
was,
think
yeah.
oh go ahead.
I'll have
No,
to beat
no.
that one.
Yeah,
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 right.
yeah. That happened because he was in Russia, and his job was to bring food to the prisoners, and so he met the man who led the rebellion, and the man convinced him to become a socialist. This is
Oh wow.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I know of the movie. So anyway,
Yeah, so
yeah.
Eisenstein and some of those earlier Soviet editors, they played with editing in a very scientific way,
Mm.
trying to see how it would affect an audience. And it's funny because I feel like even as a cinema viewing audience, we've kind of had to learn over the years what does work. I mean, the first Lumiere film with the train coming into the station, they said a bunch of people jumped out of their seats.
Oh
So you
wow.
see that it is, even in cinema, it's a learned experience because it is something completely new and different. Or I guess in the Great Train Robbery, when he shot at the screen, people were jumping out of their seats thinking they were going to get shot or something. And I guess that's just a new secondhand perception, like learning experience. But yeah, I think the merch
So
thing and everything, it's
what doesn't work? Like when you're editing, there must be some point where things
well
get
there's
too
certain
discontinuous.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, there's certain things that kind of break the normal flow that we're used to. Because I mean, after 100 years of filmmaking, and like over 80 years of feature filmmaking, there are things that we're used to, and things that are like kind of that you can use as a cheat to make things flow necessarily or easily for an audience. But some things you'll want to break those, and some directors do break those in order to like kind of slap you in the face, or to show you like, oh, this is a movie, because I want to be reflexive about filmmaking in general. um and some of those are, like, we start with a wide shot, and then we move to a medium, then we go to a close, and we realize that we're in the same world, as opposed to just starting with a close up and we don't know where we are. Just different things that all define the experience of the perception that is the film. But yeah, it's interesting that similar to, I guess, us growing up and realizing how we perceive the world is how we perceive film, and what works and what doesn't, and how to use that to tell a story. It's kind of how I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I heard like in a gunshot scene, um, do people like shoot it from many different camera angles,
Oh
so
well,
one
and
after another to sort of unnerve the spectator, so to speak, so
yeah,
you
there's
sort of
like
feel
there's
like you're
like the
being shot.
cliche like car driving shot where you like
Yeah.
have the guy driving, and then you have the hand or the foot on the pedal, the hand crank the thing, and then the other foot on the other pedal, and then the tire spinning. Is like there's this cliche thing that's like, oh, that to an audience means that he's speeding up and getting away. But then there's also things like when you're shooting a conversation scene, I'll shoot over my shoulder towards you, and then I have to stay on, like, if we drew a line between me and you, I have to stay on one side of it when I flip and shoot the reverse. Otherwise, it's going to fool the perspective of the viewer. It's called the 180 rule. And we're going to think people aren't in normal space. There are different
Huh.
perspective rules in filmmaking like
Huh.
that as long as you stick to those rules, it'll mentally make sense to somebody watching it.
So filmmaking is like really it it kind of tells us the other than the story we're learning there, it's telling us a little bit how the brain wants to perceive things, right? Because otherwise films wouldn't have worked.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I mean, there's certain continuity things like that 180 rule I was telling you.
Hmm.
It's just continuity and perspective, and then there's more artistic perspective things like we do a low shot looking up at someone, they look very powerful versus, you know, the high shot looking down, really minuscule and making a character feel smaller. Different things like that are very much kind of looking at how the brain views things.
So I'm just curious, where do you think that evolved from? You know, that could go to both of you. Obviously, okay, painting, because they had perspective, right? They had to figure stuff out about how the people want to see something. And obviously, through perception, they had to learn to change what reality was to make brains perceive it as reality, right? You had to kind of change things. Same thing with 3D images. Sometimes or regular image, you'll have to touch it to make it seem more real, even though physically it looks less real. The brain perceives it more real. So, what do you think that process was? I mean, where did that begin? Filmmaking didn't exist until early, what, like 1800, 1800 something, like 1900, right? So,
Mhm.
how did that get to that point? Do you have any ideas about it?
As far as, sorry,
Where those tools ended up showing up as being, was it just
yeah, I think, I mean, some of those things seem like they must be a little bit more ingrained in our brain, like I was saying about the angular thing, like looking up versus looking down. That seems like that goes back as far as like emperors always sitting above everyone, you know. Or just someone being above you means that you're more vulnerable to them striking you in the head or something, I would assume. And then that somebody started putting that on camera and it seemed to play. I don't know if that's something you use a test audience from, or you just kind of have the natural understanding, and then it becomes a standard in cinema. But I think a lot of these things weren't necessarily born with cinema, like you're saying, for sure, and they are kind of a deeper ingrained into the, I guess, human perceptive experience. What would you
yeah?
say, Sue?
It seems like a good study for it. That's a good thesis somewhere there, Lionel, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
It's very fascinating. Now, Paul, quick question. So, how do you interpret these problems when people show up? I mean, nobody knows what's wrong. They've got to describe what's wrong in their noggin, right? Like
It's
what?
particular. Yeah, you're right. It's okay for adults, but I think it's difficult for children and those who are. We need to extract some sort of visual information from them. Like Sue showed an earlier a Snellen chart, which had a big letter at the top, which is 660 in metric or 2200. With young children, you can do tests where rather than having to read the alphabet to determine what their individual standard of vision is in each eye, you can use picture tests where they have to point to something similar to if they can match things. Or in very young children and even babies, you can present them more in the hospital situation with a vertical striped lines which vibrate, and you make the size of the vibration smaller and smaller and smaller until their eyes don't follow it, and then that is the limit of what their fixation is. So there are ways and means of finding this out. I think it's a wonderful story of Sue's, and it just shows really that no matter whatever you think, I don't think you should ever give up on yourself. I can quote an anecdote here of a patient I had who was a 13, 14-year-old young boy who had congenital cataracts. His mother had congenital cataracts, and he was struggling at school. His vision was very poor, maybe not quite as bad as the Liam and quoted by Sue, but almost as bad. He had to have a helper at school, and I referred him to an ophthalmologist to have cataracts removed, and one of them refused to do it, so it was too risky. So I sent him to another one I had a great deal of respect for, and he did operate on his eyes, not simultaneously, but in the space of a few weeks. And with appropriate spectacles afterwards, he was able to see a standard of vision sufficient, not 20/20, but good enough for being able to drive and to go on to university and complete his studies. And it's really wonderful when you can do things like that for people.
Yeah. Again, I had a partner that had a only could see out of one eye, and because of that, he got he didn't do well in school, and they always considered him not bright. But I could tell you from working with him, and I'm not just saying it because he worked with me. he was a mechanical genius. If he would have been recognized, that's why we could work as a team, because I could figure it out, and I'm telling him he could just do it. I'd say, "This is what I got it. Here's what I need done," and he would just make it. But one of the things he did do was, if I held a wire, he could not, he could not find it. He would just have to hold it and do it. So hey, he accommodated in all these ways. But it's, I want to stress that it's so important at an early age to recognize that stuff, because it holds people back, and especially stereo vision. Because God, you could lose a great surgeon, right? If that's not found, because certainly in the future it's all going to be about stereo and mechanics. The days of chopping people up, they're getting close to the end. It's going to be sailing probes in and doing all kinds of complicated stuff with light. So it's very, and or a pilot. There's so many different things people could be employed at and improve society, because you don't know who you lose with that stuff. You don't know what impact that person would have had, but for the fact, so it's really significant to I do that with kids all the time. I used to do that and think that people just genetically, they don't get it. And I went to a course at the New York that one college. Anyway, about 3D and the effect of movies and stuff on kids, and that's where I learned about about 12 years old. You cannot really. It's very difficult, and Sue is certainly one of the exceptions. It's not it doesn't go the other way. It's very difficult to do. But now now if a kid doesn't see 3D, it's like, where's his mother or her mother? You got to get this kid tested. I don't pass up on that at all. If I'm showing them a view or something and I don't see them seeing 3D, if I get anything but a wow, get this kid to it. This kid needs because it's really significant. Everybody should know that. Walk away with that thought.
It sure does.
Show your viewers to kids. You guys were great. I could spend another. We'd close a bar together, the four of us. I would. There's no question. I could ask more and more questions. I have a million of them. But you know what? That's unfair. Because people are going to have questions in the after party, and we're going to run out of time. So, right now, stick around. Well, another great show. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Susan Berry, Samuel TRESSLET IV, and of course Paul Hutchins for sharing his images, and thanks to Gerald Marks for supplying that extra those anaglyphs. We do appreciate you. Thank you very much, Jerry, out there. And next week we'll have another great show for you. Please stop by. Thanks for taking the time in your Saturday afternoon to see what you've been missing in 3D. Now I'm going to go into the world of VR and pester those folks. I'll be there in a little while, folks, to annoy you. And I will see you all at the end of the after party. Mr. Heiser, please run the credits.